So my name is Bill Buchanan, and I lead a podcast on the world leaders in cryptography. And today we have a true world leader, Christof Paar. Hi, Christof.
Bill, thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, great. Thanks for coming along as a guest. Christof is a director of the Max Planck Institute for Security and Privacy at Bochum, Germany. He is also a member of the German National Academy of Sciences Leopoldina and
Excellent.
a fellow of the IACR and the IEEE. His research interests include the areas of lightweight cryptography, efficient cryptographic implementations, cryptographic Trojans, and physical layer security. Christof is one of the co-creators of the present lightweight cipher and of the Prince block cipher. In 2003, he founded Escrypt together with Willi Mann-heims, and which is one of the first companies to focus on industrial data security. Since 2012, Escrypt has become part of Bosch. So, what's your current role, and what does a typical day involve for you?
Yeah. So as you said, I'm one of the directors, actually one of the founding directors of a relatively new Max Planck Institute. Max Planck Institutes are federally funded research institution, very German institution. We have like some 84, 85 Max Planck Institute, many in natural sciences. There are only a few in computer science. So we're kind of this new generation, if you wish. And now with six directors, I co-founded that together with Jill Bard, who's a really famous theorist. So this is part of my day job is, ramping up a, very somewhat elite research institution, which is a once in a lifetime experience. I'm very glad about that. So there are many things about management and governance. So lots of things I maybe did not think about it that much before. But it's great. So we're very well funded, and we are really in a position to also hire fantastic junior researcher on the assistant associate professor level. So this is quite an experience. I'm also the other big initiative I'm involved prior to switching to Max Planck in 2019. I had been for 18 years at the Ruhr University Bochum, which is a big public university, like almost all universities in Germany. Where I started in 2001. So I'd been there for 18 years. We built, I think, a very powerful research center in cybersecurity. Got a lot of visibility. We got fantastic colleagues like Eike Kills, Gregor Leander, Alex May, Thorsten Holz, and so forth. So this is also partially my baby. I did that together. And Max Planck, together with Ruhr University Bochum, we have a so-called Center of Excellence. These are very elite funding by the German NSF, the DFG, the German National Science Foundation. And we just got an extension for another 7 years for some 40 million. So that's a lot of money for a German university. Yeah, and I'm also one of the coordinator in that. So these are really two fantastic opportunities. And also they're like essentially two zoos of professor, right? So at Max Planck and at Ruhr University, and we all get along very nicely, but it's still, a lot of work and sometimes somewhat delicate, right? We have to come up with your own PhD program, research agenda, and so forth. And all of that is happening in security and privacy. This is really great. So let's say towards maybe the last 10 years of my career, I have 5 more years to go. I really dramatically widened my scope from, let's say, being a applied cryptographer, hardware security guy. I really hear and think about many, many aspects of security where, frankly, I barely knew anything about. So this is I love that part of my job.
Yeah. And I know that you published a classic book in cryptography. Do you get much chance to do any teaching these days?
I still do. So I'm one of the few crazy Max Planck directors that voluntarily teach. So Max Planck, again, this is like our main job is getting Nobel Prizes, right? So Max Planck had actually pretty
Oh.
good run the last 6 years getting Nobel Prizes. There's no Nobel Prize in computer
Mm.
science, and I don't think I would be candidate even if there were. But there's no teaching duty. However, I really, really love teaching. So I'm one of the odd guys. And when I studied in Bochum in 2001, as I mentioned before, with me, Hans Dobertin, with some of the symmetrical cryptographer had heard of. He was a very prominent person in hash functions, the early hash functions, cryptanalysis in the 1990s, a very brilliant mathematician. I studied together with Hans Dobertin. He unfortunately passed away. However, what I really want to say, in 2001, Bochum started with a dedicated bachelor master's program in IT security, which was, at least in Germany, unheard of, right? This is something you maybe did in your master's, right? You took like a crypto course and a network security course, right? For long story, because there was we got industry money, and one of the condition was that we start a bachelor program. So I built that together with Hans Dobertin and all my other great colleagues in Bochum. I still feel this is my baby, and the our introductory class. I guess there's not like a canonical way how to build cybersecurity programs. The Bochum approach is our basics is cryptography. You know, this is equivalent of taking calculus if you get an engineering degree, or discrete math if you get a computer science degree.
Ohm's law for an electrical engineer. I agree.
Absolutely. You know, I'm EE, right? I'm electrical engineer by training, right? It's kind of very good, like Ohm's law, right? You know, first week we do Caesar cipher, second week we do one-time pad, right? And we still teach DES, right? It's getting a little dated. We do AS up to elliptic curves, and so on. This is a 2-semester introductory sequence, right? So this is great, right? Our students, they're typically 19 years old in Germany, so they just got their A level, so their Abitur, right? Their Matura. And it's great, right? They want to learn IT security, and plain or, let's say, applied crypto is great, right? This is really fun. We have homework assignments. They do a lot of hand calculation. They break, toy ciphers. So this is really great, and I love doing that. It's still a lot of work, obviously, right? Even though it's a lot is actually based on YouTube. My YouTube videos have been online for a while, but I still interact with the students quite a bit. And yeah, so again, this is voluntary. I think Bochum, the university, likes that I'm doing this heavy teaching course. We have like 200 new students every year, right? 200 freshmen. So it's a lot of grading, which I don't do personally. But yeah, I really love doing that. And you mentioned my books. We just almost exactly a year ago, the second edition came out. So this is great. Yeah.
Yeah. Good. And so what were your school days like, and what really sparked your interest in maths and cryptography?
Yeah. So for like German conditions, a very unusual curriculum vitae. So I'm one of the few teenagers that hated schools, right? So I did unheard of, right? So
Yeah.
no. So in Germany, basically, this is simplified, but basically after 10th grade, either you go on university bound, which in my generation were only the minority, maybe 30%. The other 70% got vocational training. I always loved doing stuff with my hand. I became a telecommunication technician. So that means I
Excellent.
spent 3.5 years on construction set, putting in cables, telephones, loudspeakers. I loved it. I really
Yeah.
loved that, right? But this is German dual system vocational training. So you also have essentially what equivalent of technical high school, 1.5 or 2 days per week. And yeah, after that, I like, oh, I also like theory, right? Then I went to Fachhochschule, which is what used to be the polytechnics in Britain, I believe. So rather applied colleges that back then were bachelor degree granting. I got a degree in telecommunication, was great. I got really good grades. I loved studying too. And then I got a master's degree at a real university, University of Siegen, and got my PhD in a new institute. And that was really, I think, shaped me in the right way, which was Institute of Experimental Mathematics in Essen, Germany. This is all we are now near the Cologne area. So this is the northwestern part of Germany.
Yeah.
Somewhat about an hour from the Dutch border. So for people who don't know Germany that well, and there I got a PhD in coding theory, where I would say I did a very average PhD thesis. There were a few nice publications, but nothing earth-shattering. However, what I did enjoy, my thesis was on computer architectures in Galois fields, in finite fields. So
Power field, yeah.
how to build hardware circuits, Boolean
Mm-hmm.
circuits and or gates to do unusual arithmetic. I really liked that. It was kind of a nice mixture of math, which I always enjoyed, these finite fields. I never learned that in school, right? So I had to, my colleagues helped me because there were a bunch of mathematicians around. And I understood enough to get dangerous, as they say in the US. But then combining that with really electrical engineering, right? What kind of gates and right. So and then I got my PhD in 94, and in late 94 I switched, actually moved to for purely private reasons, to be with my American girlfriend to Massachusetts, and I got a tenure track position at a small technical college in Massachusetts, Worcester Polytechnic Institute.
Mm-hmm.
And there it was great because it was back then it was very much teaching oriented, and say, do a good job teaching. We love, if you want, you can do whatever you want. And I said I would like to do crypto, but I don't know anything about crypto. I said, great, go for it, right? And then I started teaching crypto at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and I started learning cryptography. There were just one textbook by Doug Stinson. It had just come out, so that these were the days. The Schneier book, that probably many people here that attend, Bruce Schneier's book, had been out for maybe 2 years, I would say.
Yeah.
Still
Applied cryptography.
Exactly, yeah. And I forgot, I think the original was blue, and then later a red version came out. So I had the old one with a big errata list, and the book of Doug Stinson, who I think he's retired now. He was with Waterloo. University of Waterloo was one of the powerhouses actually in the 1990s.
Yeah.
And it was great. I didn't actually, doing my PhD, I had attended one seminar on cryptography that one of the professors had taught. And, that was all very magical, but also very mysteriously, it seemed to me, right? What is crypto desk and NSA, and, this thing. But so and then in 95, fall of 95, I taught the first master's course in applied cryptography, which was really fascinating,
Excellent.
Yeah. So, and there's this Alexander von Humboldt, which some of you know, right, is a German scientist in 18th century, and yet which is a very well-known proverb in Germany, right? The unity of teaching and science, or teaching and research, right? And this was definitely held in my case, because by explaining this new exciting topic, where there wasn't even much material, how to teach, I think this really helped me tremendously to understand 1990s cryptography. So that lured me into it. And then, sometimes you're lucky. There was a company nearby in outside Boston who did government communication equipment, government hardware. It's now General Dynamics. Some of the American attendees might have heard about that. They said, "Oh, this is a great course. Can't you teach on site?" And I was like this, small guy from Germany. What do I know, right? And then I was really lucky. I had a very nice department head, John Orr, and he said, "This is great, Christof." So I taught on, I think Monday evening I taught at WPI on campus, and Wednesday evening on site. And both courses counted towards my teaching duty. So this was great, right? So I loved doing that. And there were people that actually built crypto hardware, built for many, many years without necessarily knowing what was going on. So,
that's right.
And actually had Gerardo Orlando, one of my first PhD students, came from General Dynamics later on. He got a PhD while being in industry. So that was a great experience. And I'm still very, very grateful to WPI, to General Dynamics, my colleagues, right? So, and yeah, so that's how I got started, from, let's say, a very, I wouldn't say mediocre, but very average PhD in coding theory. I got in this hot new topic of applied crypto.
Yeah, I think you can see from your research profile, you very much come from the hardware level. I am the same. I did electronics and telecommunications, and then I built up. And then communication theory is very much relevant these days with post-quantum cryptography. We see McLeish and and other methods where the coding
Exactly. Yeah.
theory actually
Exactly. Yeah.
comes
Yeah. Yeah.
through, and the Galois fields and so on. So I think it's a great track that you've taken. So out of all the areas that you teach, that you've written about,
Yeah.
that you've
Yeah. Yeah.
researched, what's your favorite topic in cryptography?
Well, it's, the biggest fun thing is always breaking stuff. I have to be honest. There's a little bit this
Cryptanalysis. Yeah.
cryptanalysis, destructiveness. So we maybe one of the things that I really enjoyed, we did that's quite a while ago, I think 2007. We built a specialized code breaker, Copacabana, which is a weird acronym. It's cost optimized parallel code breaker. So it's a little not super elegant. Um, and that was actually grew out of work I did with the German FBI, because they had problems with password recovery back then for actually child pornography cases. So even 20 years ago, that was very terrible crime. Obviously, with the specialty that the crime itself was purely digital, right? Most I was never really involved in the cases per se, but what they told me is most of the cases is just the ownership of these terrible, pictures or videos, whatever, probably pictures back then. But even back then, people used encryption for that, right? So, and back then it was pretty weak encryption, so that nobody was using AES-256 or something, right? A lot of like homegrown crypto with weak passwords. So we did only one project which was successful, and then actually I was also part of a European network of excellence in cryptography. And for many years, this European Network of Excellence wrote what was called the annual key length report for the EU. So it was a semi-official document, and I was part of that circle. So I wrote typically the hardware-assisted cryptanalysis. And then back then, I did literally for that report. It must have been 2006 or so. I did off the back of the envelope calculation that we should be able to break death back then. That has happened earlier in '98, right? By deep crack. The people around
Yeah.
Paul Kocham built that
Yeah.
machine, but that was an ASIC-based machine. It wasn't that. I mean, it was great because it was outside NSA, but it was still, I think, $250,000 was quite a bit.
Yeah.
Didn't run very reliably because of cooling issues, right? I talked to some of the guys, right? It was fantastic, right? I mean, it was actually that was one of the projects that triggered the birth of AES, because that was, we can break that. However, that was out of reach for most people, right? But then for this algorithm report of eCrypt, this network of excellence, they said, that we should be able to do that really cheaply for 10K, right? And then I had this great colleague, Manfred Schimmler, at the University of Kiel in very northern Germany, close to the Danish border. He had a lot of experience with hardware design, said, let's do that, Christof. Right? So we literally bought Xilinx FPGAs for €8,000, $8,000, £8,000, right? All the same. And Manfred and his group built a big, massive printed circuit board. And that next thing you know, we could break death. There were these death challenges. Some people might remember that, right? There were death challenges out. And we could break death in something like 2 days, maybe. And that was
Wow.
fantastic, right? And then we did a lot of other things. Also, we wrote Adi Shamir in my group wrote a paper on breaking another cipher using that. Even though, of course, we could not break AES, like this high profile ciphers back then, late 2000s, there were quite a bit of ciphers out there that had between 56, 64 bits satellite communication.
Yeah.
But back then there was what was really this notion, yeah, it's not great, but unless you're NSA, unless British secret services, right? This is out of reach. And we said, oh no, here we're like, kids, from German university took a soldering iron, and next thing you know, for 10,000 euros, you could build a very powerful code breaker. So I think I mean, we, but I think also the community really learned the power of specialized hardware, right? Which now is the same thing we see with GPUs, right? And deep learning, all that stuff, right? It's just if you have custom hardware, depending on the problem you have, in particular in symmetric cryptography, there's a tremendous difference between running that on general purpose CPUs versus running that on special hardware. So we had for DES, which is a very extreme cipher, very hardware friendly, parenthesis, software unfriendly cipher. We get we had a cost performance advantage of a factor 10,000.
Wow.
So DES is about a factor 10,000 more efficient in hardware than in software, which is tremendous, right? Yeah. So asking, it was a long answer to a short question. That was definitely one of the fun projects we did. And then we also did asymmetric cryptanalysis, right? We broke small instances of elliptic curves. We did a little bit general discrete logarithm attacks. And again, we didn't broke full size, but we broke not toy size, but medium
No.
size, and really allowed us also to do prediction. Okay, that standard is secure, maybe not for 20 years, but maybe only for 8 years, right? And so this also influenced some of the international standards, definitely in Germany. So that's something we really enjoyed and we're somewhat proud of.
Yeah, there's a paper that I saw, I think it was Lenstra, that defined the amount of energy that it would
Yeah,
take to crack. And I think it was related to the amount of energy it would take to boil water. So you have a
yeah,
teaspoon of water to crack, I don't know, 56 bits. But then when it comes to 128 bit, you need to boil all the oceans on the planet
yeah.
millions of times over. And I think that's the main thing, understanding about how much energy it would
E-
take, because obviously it would have taken a lot of energy even for ASICs to run these things.
Exactly for death. Again, that's a factor 10,000. It's also the factor in power, right? And it was really great. We had a whole bunch of follow-up papers, and actually one had like a funny title, was something with green cryptanalysis, right? Because we used
Yeah.
less energy. And back then it seemed like a somewhat odd observation, maybe similar to the Lenstra paper. Now with GPUs, right? And we see, Google
Yeah.
is literally,
Yeah. Yeah.
or Amazon, right? They're fiddling around with nuclear power plants. This
Yeah.
is crazy, right? But kind of, 20 years ago, we had similar observation. If you do want to do real massive supercomputing, you need a shitload of power, right?
Yeah.
So, and
Yeah.
that, even for small toy cipher or smallish outdated ciphers, we had similar observations. So this was great.
Yeah. That's great. So can you outline how a lightweight cryptography method differs from traditional cryptographic methods?
Yeah, so this is a really good question. You mentioned before, I also had this fiddled around in industry with Escrypt.
Mm.
So I was one of the how I got scientifically involved in cars was really like a very peculiar problem, namely securing individual parts against replacement with knockoff parts coming out of whatever.
Mm.
Germany, Switzerland,
Yeah.
Vietnam,
Yeah.
all right, pick the country, Scotland. So, which is and actually we had an industry project with people building or trying to secure printer cartridges, right? And
Yeah.
there's crypto doing, right? They have tiny ciphers, they're challenge response protocol, very basic applied cryptography. Um, but what we encountered over and over again, and that was also actually so there was around 2005, I would say, there was this RFID craze, right? There was the
Yeah.
RFID lab, right? A spin-off of MIT, right? And everybody said, RFID is going to change the world, right? Um, but then suddenly a problem came up which had not been discussed in the crypto community. I was somewhat involved on like observer, a little bit an actor of the AES process, right? AES, the AES process, I think started in 97 and then 98, 99, 2000, there was AES 1, 2, 3 conferences. And Rindell was chosen eventually. So I was active, right, as we did implementation in software and hardware. back then, the big question was, can we do encryption at 1 gigahertz, gigabit per second, right, for fiber optics, right? That was like flying to Mars, right? Suddenly, in this RFID context, or maybe car parts, right, was a very different question. What's the cheapest way of building cryptography? And I thought, first I encountered that, okay, who needs that, right? And we were all gigabit, right? Internet, right? Really fiber optics. So, and then when I started working in the car industry, I said, this is real. There's these crazy stories. I don't know whether they're true, but I think they're basically true. They say like if you change any car part in your Volkswagen, your BMW, your Mini, whatever, right? That increases the cost by 1 cent. It takes like 1 year to decide, right? And if it's more like 10 cents, the CEO has to approve, right? I don't know whether it's true, but what it really shows you, there are applications that are brutally cost sensitive, right? So, and then, and how we started with that is because I grew up with DES when I started in crypto in late 94. DES was state of the art, right? It's what now post-quantum was DES, right? That was the thing. And that was surprisingly hardware friendly, right? So I noticed that because I always did early on, I got an SF Career Award in 98. So we did implementation and it always turned out, oh, this is almost better than everything else, right? So I did Axel Poschmann, who was my PhD student, actually his MS thesis. I said, Axel, why don't we try to make this as efficient as possible? And there have been a bunch of papers on it. And then it turned out really the main cost occur in the S boxes. And what DES does, what people don't do anymore, they had 8 different S boxes. So the biggest cost was one S box, and welcome to DES, 8 different ones. So, then we sat together with Gregor Leander, who was already at Bochum back then, really very prominent name, very one of the better known guys in symmetric cryptography. And we built a DES variant with only one S box, right? Of course, this is not DES anymore, right? This is DES X, or not DES X, I forgot what we call it. We came up with some catchy name with maybe some unproven security, but it was like a factor 3 smaller or something, right? A cipher that. And then we said, this is great. We published a paper at FSE on that. And then Axel finished his MS, and I said, Axel, you have to stay for your PhD, right? And it's great, right? And then we sat down with Gregor Leander, Axel, and me, and we said, so why don't we build a DES-like cipher, so simple SP, substitution permutation, where every single component, and there aren't that many components, right? But every single component is brutally optimized for area. I mean, that's the other thing that we learned is in area cost, so how many gates you need, is a fairly reliable predictor for the actual cost once you build that in hardware, right? Yeah, and then took us about 2 years. Us means mainly Axel and Gregor, that's the main part, to build Present, and then we got a bunch of other co-authors on board, right, that helped us with the key schedule, with the permutation. Lars Knudsen from Denmark was involved. People from Römschleb, Matt Robshaw were involved. So it was really great, and we were, yeah. And then we published it as Chess, which actually I founded. I just forgot to mention it 25 years ago, and which was one of the first times that Chess had an actual cipher. Traditionally this, you do FPGA implementation of RSA, this type of thing, right? And then we were really surprised, and we were not the first people actually who had done lightweight ciphers. There have been definitely a cipher height by Sony Corporation for like smart watches, Japanese consumer electronics. They were always far ahead, I would say, of the West, so they already looked in that. Yeah, and then Present got this crazy amount of traction. We were really surprised. Looking back, we think one reason is that it's really simple, really easy to understand. I talked to one industry guy in the US many, many years ago, and he said, oh, we needed some kind of cipher and some kind of product. And he was a very experienced industry guy. And I said, so how long did it take you to write HDL? He said, an afternoon.
Wow.
So
It's
it
has a small S box, as I remember. Is it just 16 elements to the S box.
Exactly, yeah. And that's where Axel and Gregor and the team, we spent, I don't know, 6 months on the S box, right? There was actually one really nice paper by Gregor and Axel. They looked for all secure 4-bit S boxes, which is really nice because it's so small you can still enumerate, right? Which AES is 8 by 8, you know, you have whatever 8 faculty and the whole thing is crazily large. But here, because it was so small, we got really nice theoretical insights, right? And also we essentially established, which was scientifically maybe the most interesting result thing, a lower limit. We found you cannot get much below 800 gates or so, which has to do, you need the state, you need an XOR, and that burns already 700 gates or something, right? Because the state is 64 bits, which is already borderline small, plus 80 or 128 bits. So we talking about 144 bits here of state, and in a register, each register is 6 gate equivalent. So we talk about 800 bits. So that was an interesting insight. Yeah. And now it's used, right? Just recently we heard that it's in OpenTitan, which is a very prominent open source hardware anchor, right? Which grew out of Google and ETH Zurich. They have present in as their cipher of choice. So this is really was definitely a very influential cipher. But again, we were not the first groups that did lightweight crypto. Nor are we the only cipher, and I don't know whether we're the best cipher, but it's a very prominent one. And again, I think part of it is prominent that it's very easy to understand. Yeah.
Yeah. And what problem does the Prince block cipher address?
This is good. This is not quite as prominent, but it's definitely very much real world. Yeah. So we did that together with industry, is a very well-known smart card manufacturer. This is for memory encryption. I had encountered that before that problem, but it seemed really niche to me. 15 years later, it's not niche, right?
No,
so,
definitely
yeah.
not.
So the problem is, it makes sense. You would like to keep stuff in memory encrypted. It makes perfect sense, right? And, hard disk, whatever, even on smart card. And then smart card was actually memory code. This is a lot of smart card, I think, is losing industry share, right? Because everyone is done in software, but still hardware tokens are still very valuable. You would, security-wise, you would like to protect it. So the problem here is, so that was ROM code. So what they would like to, was RAM and ROM. So I think RAM and ROM is better. So what you would ideally like to do, and it seems like a very simple problem, your CPU computes something, maybe inside the CPU is mainly fairly secure, at least, reading out registers at runtime is probably a pain. You write something to the memory, and that is fairly accessible, right? Also, memory is easy to see, right? If you open up a chip, there's like a red arrow, right? And yeah, I'm memory. That's easy to find, right? So the natural way of dealing with that, that's easy, right? We use standard symmetric cryptography, right? So when we write to memory, we encrypt, right? We go through AES or present, whatever, DES, right? We read out, and then it's stored in enciphered form, in encrypted form. Good luck with breaking that. When you read out, you decrypt. Seems very easy. The problem is the speed here, right? You want to, even if it's slow microprocessor, microcontroller clocked at 1 megahertz, you want to do that in one clock cycle, right? And we all know that. How are all modern block ciphers built? They're iterative, right? They're round structure, right? Then DES was 16, right? Present actually this is a trade-off, right? It's so small, it has 31 rounds. So that means if you write data to that, sit down, have a cup of coffee, because now we have 31 clock cycles where nothing happens.
Yeah.
We just do the stupid encryption. Then we write in, and then when you write out, another 31 clock cycles, right? So that's how industry approaches it. This is state of the art, and that for that reason we don't use strong encryption, right? We do obfuscation, but we know this is not secure. Yeah, and then we set up a great team. Again, Gregor, my dear colleague Gregor Leander was the key person behind that. a bunch of people, again, Lars Knudsen's group was involved, on Cateau, I believe, from France. Yeah, and so we designed a cipher that encrypts in one clock cycle. So that was something unheard of. What we really did, this is still an iterative cipher, so it consists of 10 rounds, but each round has a really short critical path. We're both electrical engineers, so that you can what computer architects call a full loop enrollment, which people have not really done that much, right? So you not have round one register, round two register, and then you do pipelining, everything without register. That means you put your plain text in and you run through all 10 rounds. This is one big cloud of Boolean logic, spaghetti, we call it spaghetti code, right? Or spaghetti logic, right? So and out comes the encrypted thing. So, and then we put a lot of efforts into that, how to build one individual with a very short critical path, so which not necessarily hardware costs, but critical path delay optimized. And this is Prince. And I really think this is a great service to the community, to the world, I think. So that is it's memory encryption, sounds very specific, but it's really a low latency cipher, and there is major demand.
And obviously there was a big change in lightweight cryptography when Kitcha SHA-3 came along with the sponge function.
Yeah.
So you could actually merge hashing functions with symmetric key. And I think as part of the NIST competition for lightweight cryptography, they eventually, and I couldn't believe they made this choice, but Ascon was chosen. Do you know why they chose Ascon over some of the faster ones?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great, actually. I mean, if you look, I'm not a crypto designer per se, right? When I said we designed the ciphers, this was always together with Gregor's group. He's a guy who knows really symmetric crypto. No, I think, I mean, what happened is it's a very simplified view from somebody who is not like a top specialist, but have a basic understanding. I think so. What happened historically, 1970s, 1980s, partially 1990s, there was Feistel, right? Many were Feistel, right? And then during the 1990s, there was a switch. Well, Feistel is kind of interesting, but also it's wasteful because you always only encrypt one part of the data path, so essentially you need twice as many rounds. And then we had SP ciphers, right? Substitution permutation ciphers. The most prominent example, obviously AES, right? And present, we started building that 2005, 2006, was an SP cipher that was state of the art, right? So it's not Feistel, right? We do the entire data path, 64 bits, and operate on that. Everything's good. Are there better ways of doing that? By now, I think, yes, sponge function, right? They came shortly after. So this is kind of, if you wish, the most modern, and for good reason, maybe the best or most efficient way. And as you mentioned, Ketchuk, which became SHA-3, is the example, right? Which is just more powerful than the old-fashioned SNP networks, right? So it's not, for me, it doesn't come as a major surprise that ASCON, which is also a sponge function, was chosen, because it's very efficient, it's very compact. Also, you have a lot of degrees of freedom, arguably more than an SP network, how to do the round functions, right? The round function, actually, they operate on S boxes. Ketchuk doesn't have S boxes, so you can do a lot of things, and you can, for instance, you have a lot of freedom building ciphers that are hardware efficient, which I think Ketchuk is, right? This is lightning fast in hardware and moderately fast in software. But also software, and Ascon I think is a good compromise with that, right? They built special, if I'm not mistaken, they use an S box, which is also efficiently in software because it uses bit slicing. So, and again, with sponge function, I think you have to be maybe a little bit less careful than with SNP ciphers, right? And still get a really, really strong cipher. So,
And so the Diffie-Hellman method has been around since 1976, nearly 50 years when you think about it. And it's done us very well. We have elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman, but things are going to change with a post-quantum cryptography. So how do you think key exchange encapsulation will evolve in a quantum era?
Yeah. I mean, we do a lot of work in Bochum on post-quantum. So very active. This is Peter Schwabe, who is a fellow director at Max Planck and IEEE, a really very famous cryptographer at Ruhr University. So they were heavily involved they're involved in 3 of the 4 NIST standards. So we look a lot of that, and I do a little. I started actually. I'm starting to do a little bit implementation work in that area. Yeah. Right now, there's definitely, big hype about post-quantum, probably rightly so, but maybe for just being very conservative, right? So we have to start replacing now ciphers, right? Big thing in the EU, big thing in Germany, big thing in NIST, obviously in the US, right? At the same time, it's not clear when we will see large-scale quantum computers that can actually break Diffie-Hellman with 2048 bits or factor 2000 bits RSA, right? But there's a good chance, right? They're very smart people telling me we're going to have them in 15 years, right? So, yeah, so if this happens, people can break elliptic curves, right? Can break classical Diffie-Hellman, can factor RSA moduli, right? So this is going to come. You mentioned elliptic curves. So when I started again in 95, elliptic curves is kind of the equivalent of what is post-quantum nowadays, right? So that was super exotic, right? But people were talking about it because in 95 already, Diffie-Hellman and RSA, many were using 512-bit. It was clear this is really not secure. In my lifetime, 30 years ago, right? 2024-bit, which is small nowadays. What's a big whoop? Back then, doing an exponentiation in software took minutes. Essentially useless, right? You could sell essentially 0 products. The customer had to wait, 2 minutes, 20 seconds for getting a secure connection, right? So, and elliptic curves was this magical thing. Oh, so you mean we can do a Diffie-Hellman key exchange and use 160 bit? As we know, the multiplication, which is integer modulo integer multiplication, is the key operation. And that is quadratic, and exponentiation is cubic in the bit length. So I'm going from 1,000 bits to 160 bits. This is 6 cubed, right? It's 36. So it's roughly a factor 200 speed off, right? Means we go down from, I do very much, back of the envelope mental arithmetic. We go from 200 seconds, right? Which is more than three minutes, again, which is a useless product, to 1 second. This is the factor 200, or it's 200, it's very sweet. So that's why I started working on elliptic curves, right? Which was great. I barely understood the math. Worked a little bit with Gerhard Frey, a famous number theorist in Germany, also on hyperelliptic curves. And it was great. And then, you were lucky because back then a lot of people thought elliptic curves, this is a crazy idea, right? There's so much math going on. Once the smart number theorists start looking at that, they're going to break the elliptic curve discrete logarithm problem, right? And luckily for us, for everybody, they were wrong, right? And then around 2000, 2001, NIST standardized elliptic curves for US banking. There's this FIPS standard, right? Federal Information Process Standard. And they standardized ECDH and ECDSA, I believe, which was a watershed, right? Because everybody know NSA is looking at that. That really means NSA cannot break that stuff, right? Otherwise, they would not become, federal US standard. And then I moved to Bochum, and we were very active in this elliptic curve circus, right? Waterloo, I mentioned before, they were super strong. There was this company Cerdicom. Some might have heard about it. So they commercialized elliptic curves. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Koblitz was involved. Alfred Meneses was a little bit involved in that. Scott Vanstone was more probably the most, who unfortunately passed away about 10 years ago. So that was, I lived through the elliptic curve, and, Bitcoin, right? It's the workhorse for Bitcoin, is elliptic curve DSA, right? So it's great, right? But as you said, it's probably within our lifetime. It might come to an end if we actually see full-size
Yeah.
quantum computers. Yeah.
I think we should have chosen Ed DSA as a much nicer. It was the Schnorr. It's a shame that Klaus Peter Schnorr
Yeah,
died
yeah,
in
yeah,
June. I think
yeah, yeah.
he's German, one of the great German cryptographers. He came up with the Schnorr signature, which is then based on Ed DSA, but he had a patent on it,
Exactly.
and it
Yeah,
stopped a lot of people from using it.
yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, patents and cryptography is a story by itself, right? Yeah, yeah.
And so, how does hardware reverse engineering work?
Yeah, this is good. Yeah, so this is so I started, I did roughly speaking the first 20 years. So from 1995, 2015, I did applied cryptography, all the stuff we talked about, code breaking, hardware implementation, a lot of software implementation too, actually. Really, I was like an applied algorithm guy, right,
Mm.
if you wish. Um, Side channel, right, which is also, and then in around about 10 years ago, I started looking into hardware Trojans. We had a very influential paper where we showed when if you have we assume a very powerful attacker, namely an attacker who controls the manufacturing process of your hardware chip, right? Which back then sounded like crazy. Nowadays,
Yeah.
it's digital sovereignty, big thing in the EU, I'm sure in Britain too, in Scotland too, right? US Chip Act, there's an EU Chips Act, right? Now it's hotly debated and very much accepted. So and I got a big grant, ERC advanced grant on that topic, crypto-specific hardware trojans. So really the question is what kind of manipulate if you're this powerful attacker, right? And we can that's a discussion by itself, who could do that, right? But let's assume your opponent can manipulate the hardware you're building, right? Because everything is built offshore. Nobody builds his own hardware, right? They're all fabless, right? That's a sexy term. Almost all of that happens in East Asia, right? TMSC, right, is probably the biggest player in that field, right? So, and then we thought, okay, if that's the attacker, right? If that's your setting, if that's your attacker model, what can we do? And it became clear for various reasons, would be really nice if you have a better, let's just put it for the beginning, understanding of hardware reverse engineering. If you get a high security chip, very sensitive, maybe national security stuff, but maybe just my iPhone 13 or something, with this TPM chip or whatever, right? How can we verify that it's not manipulated? You can do outside tests, but there was a really nice paper by Muti Young and Jung in '98 on kleptography. I
Yeah.
remember seeing that, right? So they and back then that what is Muti doing there, right? Because the kleptography setting was exactly that, was the hardware is controlled by the attacker, right? And what they showed that you can build in hardware, which we would call hardware Trojans, the vectors nowadays, that are provable, non-detectable, right? So this is terrible. So all this verification stuff will come to a limit in this admittedly very strong attacker setting. So one thing is in software, you open up, you check the code, which is not even that sophisticated, right? What do we do in hardware, right? And this hardware reverse engineering always existed as a term. We started working on that 10 years ago, and we quickly learned there is very little reliable literature on that, right? There were some EEE people, so IEEE electrical engineers, that came up that solved sometimes very nice paper, said like we can recover a finite state machine or something like that, right? But this whole picture, what about a real world setting? You have a chip with, I'm not even talking about a billion gates, right? This is, the latest iPhone, 2 million gates. How do we
Mm.
deal with that, right? And that's what we've been doing for 10 years now. And it's really fun. So we had bunch of PhD theses on topic we started 3 years ago. a workshop series in Bochum, Harris, where for the first time we got the actors together, and it's a very fragmented community. There's some specialized companies, there's some researcher, but even the researcher, some are much more EE leaning, right? Electrical engineers, a few applied crypto people. There are, not surprisingly, government agencies also interested in that. Not that much, I mean, as I can tell, for planting hardware Trojans, or they wouldn't tell me, but that we are really worried, right? We get hardware for super sensitive NATO stuff, for super, Angela Merkel's iPhone type of thing, right? Diplomatic traffic between German embassies and stuff. How do we do that? And there are a bunch of problems out there. But what we started doing with Harris, and I'm very happy with it, we got people together and talking, right? So, and we had in last week, so we can maybe, I can send you a link, maybe we can post that too. So we got maybe 130, 140 people. And again, it's really this mix from industry, research institution. Then we have very interesting research institutions, Fraunhofer institutes, institutes in France, that are VLSI institutes, right? That do, physics type of failure analysis of ICs, right? They know a lot of stuff how to do that, right? We talk about law enforcement thing, then, and yeah. So, and what this really entails, there are really two big steps, right? One is you get your chip, right? You have to open up, you have whatever, 12 metal layers with wiring, and then the transistor layer on the bottom. So you have to open up, essentially taking photos with an electron microscope, recover the net list. And this is very, very difficult. Because these ICs were not built for that purpose, right?
No. I suppose it's like a printed circuit board has multi-layers. It'd be like taking off all the layers and seeing if there was any chips or any connections that really weren't allowed.
Exactly. So, and this is actually what we're not doing. I mean, this is not the strength of my group, right? Again, this is really people much closer to chip design, a lot of physicist type of thing. And this is well understood, but it's still very hard. It's particularly hard doing that with error-free.
Yeah.
You cover, let's say, 1 million transistors. Let's say an error rate 0.1%. You have 1,000 errors in that, right?
Yeah.
What my group has been doing, and this is fun, we assume we have a given net list which is totally or almost error-free. And we do the fancy term is sense making. We try to understand that, right? What is going on, which is much harder than we thought. I thought, and I was wrong, I thought, once you look at a net list, it can't be that hard to find buses, say, oh, okay, this is your CPU, this is whatever your IS accelerator, this is your analog stuff, right? The memory. This is very hard. It has to do that these synopsis and so forth, these design tools are very brutal in optimizing, right? The synthesis. So you get this big spaghetti, huge net list. And so we've been building for almost 10 years an open source tool, which is called HEL, which is the computer from Space Oddity, right? Which is an open source tool for net list analysis, which is cool, right? You can write your own code. You can look for stuff. And we've been very successful. Just last year, we had a paper at Crypto, the big crypto conference in Santa Barbara, where we use the specific properties of block ciphers, namely you have a little bit of data, you do a lot of operation on data, right? And then after X rounds, you output it to reliably find block ciphers in an unknown, even large net list. And that's right. So we do essentially graph type of algorithms. So this is really fun. Yeah. And this also includes FPGA. We do a lot of FPGA reverse engineering in practice. We also made a big paper last year where we actually, there was one iPhone model that had really surprisingly a small FPGA on board. So we reverse engineered the entire FPGA, which was really interesting. And so by now, I think we have a pretty good feeling how to do that. And I think we helped a little bit the community, people that are interested in doing that. So yeah. And now we're looking kind of for the next adventure. What's the next big challenge?
That's great, yeah. And so how does IR Shield work as a countermeasure against adversarial physical layer wireless sensing?
Oh yeah, Bill, thank you so much. This is a good question. So this is what I talked about so far. Essentially, my group is not that big, so we have maybe 10 PhD students and postdocs. So one focus is this hardware reverse engineering, looking at Trojans and also doing applied crypto. This is kind of what we discussed so far. I have another two PhD students and postdocs who work on physical layer security, which is an area I studied 10 years ago, and I was kind of, let's say, daddling on the side on that. But this has scientifically become super interesting. We had really nice research results on that. So as you can tell, most of my work the last 30 years was at the intersection of somehow electrical engineering and crypto, right? Can be also a lot of plain old algorithm work, but often more EE-ish, right? And yeah, so we do the fancy term is physical layer security. So this is in a nutshell. We look in what is the interaction between security and Wi-Fi radio waves. So it's like the layman's, yeah. And maybe I start where we started, which is a very old problem. So I think literally the first industry project I did when I was at WPI in 96 and 97. So it was my first or second year there. Was a company in Germany, actually, by coincidence. They were building road toll boxes, which was very forward-looking. They were actually selling them to East Asia. They were way ahead of Europe back then, right? And they already had one security problem, namely what happens if people get access to these boxes, which are on the Autobahn, right, or the highway, open that up and fiddle around with a crypto chip, whatever, right? So what you needed here is tamper detection, right? You wanted to know, and also Ross Anderson, who also passed away, right, tragically 2 years ago. He had
Cambridge.
this beautiful papers about 20 years ago, right, that you can easily manipulate point of sale credit card terminals, right, just by inserting a needle, right, and wiretapping. So we had one great success, and this, as far as I can tell, they're not very mature solutions outside industry. They use a lot of kind of hand-grown meshes that go around little switches. If you open the box, the switch goes off, this kind of thing, right? Which is a lot of experience, and you don't have much like of security guarantees. So it was one of the applications that we did. Well, one way of doing that very nicely, if you have some kind of enclosure, right? Could be a 19-inch computer cloud rack, can be a small point of sales terminal, can be an ATM machine, right? Very relevant. And in Germany, we have a lot of problems with people blowing up ATM machines, right, with gas. So what you do, you put two small antennas, and don't have to be sophisticated antennas, in your enclosure. One sends, the other receives Wi-Fi, right? Just signals, right?
Mhm.
And then it's really interesting. These settings are incredibly sensitive. So like a fraction of a millimeter, if you change anything a fraction of a millimeter, the radio waves get reflected differently, right?
Yeah.
So we did really nice experiment, had a really great paper on that. So this is, I think, I think when we did that and we got our, I think it was an S&P Security and Privacy paper 2 or 3 years ago, we said, oh, okay, this is really great. Now with this IR Shield, and we're not alone. There's a community, of course. There are other really great groups doing great work in that area. So what another group did very interestingly, this is really a privacy attack. The setting is like almost once you know this is an attack vector, it becomes totally obvious. The setting is you want to detect if somebody is in a room, if somebody is moving in a room, right, and you're outside the building, right, and then almost all offices, whatever private spaces have Wi-Fi's right now, right, and the Wi-Fi signal, as we know, that beams outside, right. I'm here in my home office, right, so the neighbors across the street, 30 meters, right, they can see my Wi-Fi signal. They can't decrypt because they're encrypted, but can see the signal. If I move my chair, if I get up, right, neighbors across the street, they will see changes in this Wi-Fi thing.
Right.
Remember what I
Yeah.
just said in this enclosure?
Yeah.
We talk about fraction, about a millimeter, right? But if a person, me, very macroscopic object moves, right, So there was a really nice paper at CCS 5 years ago said, oh, this is dangerous for privacy, right? I mean, maybe they don't learn by heartbeat, but even though the people are working on it, but definitely the presence and movement of people in the room, right? So, and then what we did, we have this really nice toy in physical layer security. There's a lot of communication people working on the communication engineers. There's what's called an intelligence reflecting surface. So this is roughly what we have on the deck. This is DIN A4, right? The college block size, right? So what you put on them are small diodes, right? So you get a matrix of diodes, let's say 128, right? 16 by 8 or whatever, right? And these diodes, they look like little aluminum stands, right? They're 2 by 1 centimeters, not very exciting, right? And they have two states. Either you don't do anything to them and there's a radio wave coming in, it's reflected. Or you activate the diode behind it and then it does something physically very weird. Wave comes in, and they're all sinus wave. You get a 180-degree phase shift. That doesn't happen in nature. It happens, but with this electric thing. Because you have 128 of these, and each of them can be controlled, right? You have 2 to the 128 configuration. So what the communication engineers do, they use that for beamforming. Kind of like a very easy to understand, particular 5G, 6G type of thing, right? So there's a lot of literature on that, right? So we're using that for security application. And a really nice was this IR shield because what we did, we said, okay, we put one of these IRS things, and they're very simple. We have a nearby college who built that for us for little money. You get them for a few €100, right? And then we came up, and that was the core of our research. So we essentially, the intuition was we want to put that next to your Wi-Fi antenna. We randomly change that all the time. So that means if my nosy neighbor across the street want to see whether Christof moves in my room, right? It's always random, right? It turns out to just randomization doesn't do the trick, right? So we came up with many experiments, but it turned out to with this relatively simple and actually, if you would actually commercialize it, very cheap countermeasure, I think. If we give that out to China to manufacture, you can probably get that for a few euros or pound. And that it's very powerful for hiding movements, even in relatively large spaces. So, and we were quite excited about that, right? And also, my intuition was, and I was wrong, if you do that, you also mess up the Wi-Fi signal, right? You get this dramatic degradation. But it turns out modern Wi-Fi, right? This all happens on the physical layer, which we never touch, right? This is deep inside this really cheap Wi-Fi chips. They're adjusting the channel constantly, right? In the millisecond range or something, right? Whereas our randomization is more macroscopic, so we do that every few hundred milliseconds. So we do some smart randomization, let's put it this way. But the Wi-Fi channel, between my laptop and my Wi-Fi router is so fast that the degradation, we have problems measuring that. So that was maybe the most surprising thing, that you can dramatically increase privacy for people wired observing outside, but you don't really degrade your own Wi-Fi communication channel. So that was kind of a cool finding, yeah. And again, it's this interaction between communication technology and now privacy, maybe not crypto, but security. So that's cool.
I think there was a research paper that monitored a baby's heartbeat through Wi-Fi in the next room, and they could actually detect it from there. So it's quite amazing what can be detected. And you're right, you can detect people moving around with Wi-Fi. So it's a very, very interesting area. And I know that you've worked a lot on side channels around chips. So can you give us a good example of a side channel on a device?
Yeah. So it was also an influential paper we had in 2008. There was a key lock Keylock is really an algorithm, but was also a chipset. So Keylock was used for keyless door opening. All right. Out of South Africa, in the old days when there was 1980s, when there was an embargo, right? Because had an apartheid regime there. So they had a lot of defense industry in-house in South Africa because nobody in the West would sell them chips. So they had this Keylock, which is essentially challenge response algorithm, which is kind of let's say an unusual type of like a 1-bit block cipher, really like a hybrid between block cipher and stream cipher. To the point it was used where we got most press of, and then it got leaked because I think it was hardware based. It got leaked. There had been papers on that cryptanalysis. It turned out to be not very secure, which is not surprising. It was a 1980 cipher, so we talked 20 years later, so it was 2006, 2007. But it was still one of these instances, even though the cipher is insecure, it works perfectly fine for challenge response protocols. Also, you don't have streaming data with gigabits of ciphertext, right? You have one block every minute if somebody. And so we got a lot of press because some cars had it in, but not that many. There were, I think, maybe Ford or Fiat, but not very modern. But market leader in Europe for garage door openings. So that was the go-to algorithm for doors. Yeah. So what you need to do is, and then we learned, is big pain in practice always key management, right? So what all the garage door manufacturers, and they're finitely many, right? We don't have 1 million, we don't have thousands, there may be a dozen in Europe or 2 dozens, right? So what they did, they had one manufacturer key. They had one master key. And once you have the master key from this, all the individual keys are derived, between bill you, and your key fob and your garage at home, right? And now we had to get the master key out, right? And that's, people haven't done the real symmetric cryptographer because they couldn't do that. They needed still 10 to the whatever 30 measurements. But then we succeeded. There was Amir Moradi, was a postdoc in my group, very brilliant guy, now famous professor, one of the leading authorities in side channel analysis. So he was actually visiting PhD student, a later postdoc. He did that. So he used side channel. So we literally went to the hardware store in Germany, got this garage door opener for 200 euros, right? So we let it run and took power measurements of that, right? So there's a small microprocessor, was software implementation, right? Small microprocessor. And then essentially, and running this keylock block cipher. And I mean, by intuition, it makes sense, right? So this software somehow, in a very subtle way, depends on the actual key bits, right? Well, whatever happens, right? You have this, I think 64-bit, you have the 64 bits, and probably in 2 registers, 32 bits. And somehow it must matter what the actual bit pattern is, right? It must somehow, because the transistors flip differently, right? 0 to 1 transition is probably different from a 0 to 0 transition, this type of thing, right? The question is, can we exploit that, right? And there was this brilliant work by Paul Kocher, right? Started the side channels in 99. And DPA is the most powerful one, differential power analysis. And there's been this great book by Elisabeth Oswald, who's back in Britain, right? And Stefan Mangard at TU Graz. There was a third author whom I forgot on DPA, right? So, and then Amir and other people in my group, they really sat down and measured for months. Once it's really measuring is really hard, right? Without noise, right? Yeah, and then you essentially do relatively, in retrospect, relative basic statistics and get the key out, right? So what we were able then, we pulled out the master keys, not from all, but by several garage door manufacturers. And with that was a really devastating attack. Once we had the master key, we needed 1 or 2 just car opening, you going home, bill later on, right? You use your key fob remote, garage door entering. We just have to wiretap. Very easy in practice because the signal are by purpose really strong, right? So we can 100 meters, 200 meters, right? So you need one, at the most two of them, together with the master key. We can recover your individual key and, you know, open your garage door. So that was really devastating attack. Yeah, and it had to do with the fact that we, of course, you need access. This is always a big if, or sometimes a medium if, right? We need access to the victim device, right? So in this case, you bought the garage door opener for relatively little money, used an oscilloscope. What is interesting, so we literally we needed many months. Once we know how that went, it's really easy. There's several universities also, University Louvain-la-Neuve in Belgium. They have it as a bachelor lab experiment, you know, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
you know, the second year, very smart EE and CS students, they do our attack, right? Because once you know really how to do the measurement, you run a MATLAB script, right? So, you know, we don't need NSA type of supercomputers, right? So that's kind of the scary thing with that, right? Yeah.
mm. And do you think side channels are still a major problem with integrated circuits? And what methods can we use to overcome these?
Yeah, yeah. So that's what is surprising. So again, they were proposed, discovered by Paul Kocher et al. In the late 1990s. Everybody was surprised, shocked. Everybody, including me, said it can't be that hard to prevent them, right? We add some noise, blah, 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 blah. You can add noise. The problem is these are just statistical methods, right?
Mm.
And it's easy to make side channel attacks harder. It's way harder than anybody would have thought to get rid of them altogether. You know, and this is what, you know, my colleague Ami Moradi, for instance, does. He does this thing, right? I mean, they collect millions of traces over the weekend, right? We have kind of sophisticated measurement setups, and then they have 10 million. And if there's some statistical bias in that, right, the key leaks, right? And that makes it really hard, right? Still, yes, people have made much progress, right? And then you can say, okay, we have that, and now you need 10 billion in order to sample that you have to measure for 10 years, right? So this is kind of what is more interesting, that there's a modern incarnation of side channel attacks, which are these micro-architectural attacks, which work differently, right? Which have become really dangerous, right? They're technically also side channels, so it's a similar principle, except here we're not using electrical signals, but we use, if you wish, crosstalk side channels between different processes running on a CPU, right? And uses unusual behavior in the microarchitectural architecture of the microprocessors, right? So, and they are also really hard to get rid of right now, right? So the story continues. Yeah, I'm not working on this microarchitectural attack. We have Yuval Yarom we got him from Australia to Bochum a couple of years ago. He's one of the prominent people working on that. Yeah, so it's very fascinating area. Also in the context of PQC, right? This could be a dangerous attack. Yeah.
And so what are the methods that could be used to crack an FPGA?
Yeah, so FPGA is interesting. So maybe for the interested reader, listener, right? So FPGAs is hardware devices, and if you buy them from eBay or whatever from your vendor, they're done, right? They're big, right? They approach millions of gate equivalents. They must be programmed. And there's one peculiar fact about them. So you need what's called a bit stream. Is a program. It's a machine code, if you wish, right? Really low level, and the many little switches and little lookup tables, you know, which function as gates, which you have to configure. This is called the bit stream. Few million bits, right? This is the size, right? For technological reasons, and normally you'd say, where's the problem? We put it on chip. For technological reasons, they don't reside on the FPGA. They're always on an outside flash or other memory, right? So that's a vulnerability, right? So if you want to attack FPGA, reverse engineer FPGA, how do you do that? So what the two big vendors, which is Altera, which is part of Intel, and Xilinx, which is now part of AMD, but I still call them Altera and Xilinx. They have like 80 plus percent of the world market, and there's several other smaller ones out there, right? So they all started to introduce around the turn of the millennium, 25 years ago, bitstream encryption, which seems to be the perfect solution. So the bit stream, in the factory at the end of the conveyor belt is being encrypted. You put that on your flash, encrypted AES 256-bit. Good luck breaking that. Upon power up, when you switch on your device, your airplane or your router, whatever you have, right, your medical device, you read in the encrypted bit stream, you decrypt on the FPGA, everything's fine, right? What scientists did in my group was quite active in that we found numerous ways of this very simple, right? Very simple. You have an FPGA which is fully controlled by Xilinx, by Altera, right? Fully controlled by that to break that, right? And actually, the first was Amir with Pavel, one of my PhD students, about 10 years ago, with side channels, and that was one of the things that was not. By the way, this door opener. So we needed like a few hundred samples. Here we needed millions of samples, but we succeeded. So that was scary. And then there have been a whole bunch of other attacks, including from my group. The most devastating was by Mike Ender, a PhD student, now postdoc in my group. He came up maybe 4 or 5 years ago, with the Starbleed attack. So what he found, there wasn't actually protocol failure in the decryption engine. So of course, we did not break AES, right? But under certain conditions, they did decryption on chip, everything was supposed to do. But if you interrupted the power supply, they saved the decrypted text in some register, which we can read out later. I have no idea how Mike came up with that. I mean, he's brilliant.
That's amazing.
Right? Spent a lot of time. He actually found some hints in the manual, right? 320 pages, page whatever, 188. He said, oh, this is star register, and that's why we call it Starbleed. What big picture? So what you can do, then you can decrypt that. You can do all kind of. For instance, you can insert Trojans in that, then, right? Once you have the decrypt the bit stream, because you can decrypt, change the hardware architecture, encrypt again, and put it on your device. So there's a lot of very unpleasant things you can do. What I like most about that is even a seemingly very simple problem, right? An FPGA, which is under total control of very experienced hardware designer, right? The only function you have to do, a decryption engine, right? It's a pain in the neck. A lot can go wrong, right? So it wasn't only, I think there have been 4 classes of attacks. 3 are from us, right? The side channels, the Starbleed attack. We also did essentially a hardware fuzzing attack by Paar, but they also have attacks by other people. So that means doing cryptography right, if you have powerful attacker, is difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, I only have 2 more questions to ask. So thank you for hanging on so long.
Yeah, great.
So you published a paper which questioned the end of logic locking. Can you describe what logic locking is?
Yeah, logic locking is a very interesting technique. So the original goal was, which I assume is true, is a problem in the hardware industry. This is called overproduction. So the example is given. There's the Bill and Christof hardware Inc. here in Europe, right? And we have some brilliant chip which is used for, I don't know, graphic acceleration for gamers or whatever, right? So of course we don't own our chip fab, right, for 10 billion pound, right? We do that in Asia somewhere, right? And then the story goes, the threat model is, so the factory builds our chip, we get the chip for $1 a piece, right? And from 9 to 5, the fab builds our chip. After 5, they continue and they're selling it on the gray market, right? So that's called overproduction. And I'm sure it's true. So now the seemingly good solution to that is logic locking. So that was proposed maybe 2010, I would say. So the idea is, again, you have this net list, lots of little gates and registers, right? and more or less randomly, you pop in XOR and not XOR gates in any line, right? Sorry, AND gates. So AND gates and NAND gates, right? So here's what happened, if you suddenly you have an extra input, right? So if you put a 1 on that, we know that if this is one of these pins, the input pins of an AND gate is a 1, the other pin is connected to the output, right? It's an open switch, right? It's a closed switch, right? If you put a 0, it opens up, right? And this is logic locking. Then the idea is you throw 128 of them, maybe random, maybe not random, either AND or NAND gates, and then you have to provide 128 zeros and ones as additional input. Without that, the circuit doesn't work. This is logic locking, right? Seems very convincing, cool idea. Except our claim is we're sure that works, the application for that. But what we claimed, it does not work for the intended purpose, because here we assumed that the fab, so the people who build the chip, are the attackers, right? And then detecting logic locking would be very easy. I mean, just you can, almost visually see that. So you put this additional 128 bits in, you have to run lines to that, and these lines have to come together. So you need another input. You don't need a PhD in reverse engineering to detect that. So we essentially claim if you do that, and again, we're not saying this is useless, there's no application, but we say against this overproduction, which is particularly US military really crazy about, right? This is not going to work, right, under this attacker model. So we have really problems publishing that paper, because when it was real, which we as hardware designer or hardware applied crypto people not good, is this modeling, right? Actually, what modeling is, what is the assumption? What can the attacker do? What can Alice and Bob do, right? If you think that true, it was almost trivial to say this is not, this is a nice method. There are probably things we can do with it. This is not against overproduction, right? Yeah. So, and that was the paper, and we got citation, but we also heard that industry stopped using logic locking due to our paper, right? So, yeah. And I think this is from a big lesson learned, which I always like, reflecting. So what did we do? So this was not deep cryptanalysis, right? It was carefully security thinking, right? Is that it's, and there's a whole research community published papers on that, right? Doing more logic locking, doing FSM and doing this and that, right? And we essentially saying, no, under the normal model that you consider, this is insecure, whatever you do, because the attacker almost visually sees the key, right? So that it's for scientists, very smart people, it's also really easy not to see the forest because of trees, right? This type of thing, right? So that's, yeah. So again, I don't even that widely quoted. We do know it has really nice impact in industry, which is more important than getting citations, frankly. Yeah.
That's great. And so if you could change one thing about your career, what would it have been? You have such a varied career, from telecoms, electronic engineering.
Well, I think, because I'm straight EE, I think if I had to do it again, I would have gotten a master's degree in computer science, because once in a while, I'm still dabbling around with a lot of algorithms, right? A lot of algorithms work, right? And, more than once it shows that I don't have a formal trade in computer science. Also, I'm a terrible programmer, right? So, I stopped with C, right? Essentially, it's all my students do the programming. So I think, whatever, 30 years ago, it would have been probably good to. I got a master's in VLSI design. I think, looking back, it would have been more, let's say, CS with some algorithms, some software would have been better off. But then, on the other hand, I'm happy being the hardware guy in the crypto universe.
Yeah, that's great. Well, it's been a real privilege to speak to you, and thank you so much for using up so much of your time, and really just keep up the great work. I think you fill an amazing niche. Security is moving more and more and more into the hardware, into the silicon, and we need more research like the work that you've been doing. So thank you so much.
Bill, thank you so much, and thanks for listening patiently. Okay. Hope to see you soon in person. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.